My name is Gene Kim with MassMutual Investments. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we greatly appreciate your time with us. We also want to thank Excel 401k for having us and making this virtual session possible. Today's breakout on Beyond Fiduciary, Ascending Through the Fire with an Evolving Fiduciary Governance Approach, is going to be covering an often overlooked aspect of qualified retirement plan operations, mainly the need for a prudent and comprehensive governance process and who should be quarterbacking these efforts. We're super excited to have Mark Cover and John Carl as our speakers today. Mark Cover is the head of Defined Contribution and Investment Only Field Sales at MassMutual Investments. In this role, Mark manages MassMutual's external wholesalers who work directly with retirement-focused advisors. Prior to MassMutual, he served as the head of DCIO Field Sales for T. Rowe Price and was the national sales manager for ADP Retirement Services, among other prominent roles. Mark has spent the majority of his extensive career focused on the retirement industry. We are also joined by John Carl. John is founder and president of the Retirement Learning Center, the nation's preeminent thought leader on retirement issues. A veteran of the retirement industry, John has been featured on many national news broadcasts that include CNBC, CNN, Forbes, ABC News, The Wall Street Journal, among others. As the advisor to advisors, John is highly sought after as an industry insider who travels the country educating groups of financial professionals on the very latest in retirement legislation, forecasts, and developments affecting the industry. Certainly tons of knowledge and tons of experience between our two speakers today. And at this point, I want to thank Mark and John for joining us and turn it over to Mark.
Thanks, Gene. What's really amazing about this global pandemic is the array of challenges that plan sponsors have faced, and that's a lot of what we want to talk to you about today. So back in March, the Retirement Learning Center and MassMutual got together and outlined kind of for advisors and plan sponsors some of the challenges and really kind of the stages that we had seen were most likely going to transpire. Back in March, we were in what we called stage one, and stage one was nothing more than plan sponsors was thinking about one thing and one thing only, their economic viability of their business. They had to recreate a business plan in 30 days and figure out should they keep employees, and retirement was part of that because retirement is one of the biggest expenditures of every plan sponsor. As they did that, CARES Act came about, and that really moved us into stage two, which was the implementation stage. And in that implementation stage, they were figuring out how to kind of deal with their retirement plan. And now what we feel we are in is stage three. Stage three is an incredible opportunity for plan sponsors to really re-engage their thought process of their governance model and their overall retirement plan. So as they think about their retirement plan, the adversity that they faced over the last 3 months is incredible information to help them figure out how to advance the retirement plan and make it better going forward. We know that they're tired and fatigued from all these stages, but we really would encourage them to maximize this great information that they have before they forget about it and figure out ways to kind of enhance and improve the retirement plan. And that's really what we're going to talk to you today about. So you might be asking why MassMutual DCIO is engaging in this type of conversation, and there's 2 reasons for that. First is, from an investment philosophy standpoint, everything we do is tied to the retirement marketplace. All of our products are designed to help you as an advisor build out a more cohesive, consistent stream of performance for participants, recognizing that they're thinking about their long-term retirement plan. The second aspect is MassMutual as an organization itself. We are ranked number 89 in the Fortune 500 companies, and that gives us a great opportunity to think a little bit differently. One of the slogans that I'm very attracted to as an organization in MassMutual is we think of the world in terms of decades and not quarters. And so when we started to really think about who we want to be as a DCIO organization, how we want to help retirement advisors and add value, that foundation led to a program that we created called Plan Champion. Plan Champion is simply a tool and a resource to bring to you advisors to make you the plan champion for your plan sponsors and their participants. Our effort and our thought process was founded on 2 very specific things. One was, like we said, we want to make you the plan champion. We want to make you front and center. While it's important, of course, to be branded at MassMutual level, we see a lot of organizations that take that a touch too far. And we really want to put you front and center. So everything that we put together for the Plan Champion program is branded at the advisor level. The second aspect of Plan Champion is we wanted to be part of the entire sales process. So we recognize that there's a lot of really, really good tools out there. And sometimes what we see is it gives you a great idea, but it really doesn't help connect the dots of taking that idea, giving you specific actions and thoughts to bring that to life, and then ultimately bringing that to a plan sponsor in a cohesive manner. So when we thought about Plan Champion, we established kind of a model that ranges from targeting clients all the way to winning business, to closing business, and then retaining business. And so as we thought in that model, we seeked out a lot of different tools and resources within the industry that could fit underneath there. And that's where Retirement Learning Center and the Hero 7 tool that we're going to be talking about today fits in. The Retirement Learning Center was a great piece for us to partner with unbelievably knowledgeable people such as John that can bring incredible insights to you and really connect the dots with this idea we're going to bring forth of Chief Governance Officer. So we're excited to kind of package all this together. Please understand at any point, you can reach out to us later after this call and talk about it. So with that, I wanted to pass it over to John Carlin. John, I do have to say, as I was looking at the bios, I'm going to have to work on my own bio. I mean, Wall Street Journal, CNBC, extremely impressive. I don't know how you managed to get that, but I'll turn it over to you, and looking forward to a great conversation around Chief Governance Officer and some great ways that we could look at the business.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure and privilege. And I'll let you know that secret. It's just that I've been doing this for way too long, unfortunately. And the subject matter is so tantalizing, but I'll tell you, we're going to have a little bit of fun here today on this presentation. Plan Champion program is a great thing. And really what we're branding here is the governance process and creating a new role in the industry for you, the financial advisor, to take a new approach in the way you're benchmarking plans, the way you're looking at plans, adding tremendously new value to your plan sponsor clients and prospects. And again, creating a new Chief Governance Officer role for you in the industry, which I think is going to be very exciting, something that's not talked about a lot, and something that delivers tremendous value. So let's go through our learning objectives today that we're going to try to accomplish. Number one, we're going to understand the importance of what a governance process really is and what it means, and how you can assist plan sponsors in crafting one. We're going to actually identify areas of conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest happen, they're there. And it's really not the fact that they're there, it's how do you address them and how do you, as that Chief Governance Officer, assist in the addressing of these conflicts of interest. And of course, that helps you avoid the legal implications of various related documents. We're going to talk about the multiple service providers that drive any governance of a plan and how you can synchronize the management and the oversight of those in your governance process. And then as said, we're going to add a concept of how you can approach benchmarking going forward in a new next generation 3.0 manner. So let's look on the next slide at the important questions we're really going to address today. So what are the responsibilities of plan officials, whether they have you supporting them or not? What are they on the hook for? What are the elements of good plan governance? We know good governance is out there. We hear it in the corporate world, and we hear the nightmare stories of most recently a WeWorks that had poor governance on the corporate side of the equation. Those lawsuits that we see, the schlichters out there, you get the specific reasons. Everybody's like, oh, they're fee related. No, they're governance related. If you have proper governance, you're addressing each of these aspects individually. So that's really what we're talking about. What are the elements that are going to make you running a plan in good governance? Who's responsible for creating and executing the plan? I think we know the answer to that, but we'll go through the process. What does a good governance process look like, and who is involved, and how can you structure it going forward? So let's look in on the next slide who the governance team and what the process is going to look like. And if we delve right into it, let's get into the core responsibilities of plan officials. Like I said, what are plan officials responsible for with or without you supporting them? Well, this is a little bit remedial, but the number one issue is the exclusive benefit rule. The plan must be run for the exclusive benefit of the participants in the plan. If you go back and you look at all of the lawsuits that come out here, again, the schlichter, excessive fee lawsuits, those aren't necessarily the reason behind the lawsuit. Yes, is excessive fees, but what is that violating? Well, that's violating that the plan was not run for the exclusive benefit of the participant. If you look through the readings of that, that's what you'll find. And therefore, what we also know is that at any given plan sponsor, there's probably nobody coming into work every day in the mid and the small size market in particular whose sole job and responsibility is to come in and run the ERISA plan or plans that are there. But plan sponsor, in fact, in the EBSA, it says might have an unreasonable burden to operate in their fiduciary capacity. And therefore, it is not just their obligation, it is their responsibility implicitly to bring in that prudent expert to help them address their fiduciary actions. And that's where you come in, of course. Of course, there's the plan document rule. You have to make sure that you're governing the plan documents. And we're going to talk a little bit about today in the governance process. There's multiple documents that are driving the management of a plan. And many of those providers are disparate and have never been synchronized. Again, a great role for you to do. And then the investment diversification rule, something that you quite excel at. So what are the elements on the next slide of a good plan governance? Well, selecting and monitoring plan service providers that we talked about, many of them are disparate, and synchronizing those is a big one. Overseeing the investments, that's something that you're doing tremendously well. But then also operating the plan in accordance to the new governing documents and the laws and the regulations. Certainly Washington is the gift that keeps giving to a plan advisor, and keeping up to date and on top of that is part of the governance process and a great role for you. That involves updating the documents and fulfilling the reporting disclosure, et cetera. Conflicts of interest, we mentioned that before, we're going to talk about that. And then how do you build and maintain a governance document and a governance process? And that's really a new document that is the overarching umbrella, if you will, that every other aspect of management of a plan fits into. And that's where that chief governance officer comes into. So if we are going to create a new document, let's look at the next slide. The importance of having it a governance policy document, which is the umbrella, if you will, that all of their obligations and duties, et cetera, fall under, with you managing that process. What does that governance policy document say in it? It says who is responsible for what, who are those responsible parties. It clearly assigns the duties, rights, and obligations to them. It defines the actions and how they're approved. It defines the frequency of meetings. Of course, you have to meet those obligations. We will make those reasonable and manageable that you can do. It identifies the recurring agenda items and the also the opportunistic ones that are along the way. And it essentially just prescribes a process for archiving and creating and monitoring the overall management of the plan. And that's really what we're getting at. So let's go into a little bit of ERISA Jeopardy on the next slide here and take a little quiz time here. So at the end of the day, who is responsible for creating and executing this governance process? Is it A, the record keeper? Is it B, the advisor? Is it the TPA? Is it the 338 fiduciary? Or is it E, none of the above? We'll give you a second to think about this one. Log this in your mental computer. And lo and behold, on the next button, the answer is it's none of the above. Who is it? Who is responsible in quiz time here? Who is responsible? Well, on the next slide, I think you know who is responsible. We talked about it previously. Who is responsible for this on the next slide is the plan sponsor. This plan sponsor at the end of the day is responsible for their fiduciary obligations and for the proper governance and management of the plan. Now remember our prudent expert rule that we talked about. If they don't have the internal chops or capacity and bandwidth in-house, what is their obligation? Their obligation is to bring in that third-party expertise, that prudent expert, if you will, to address and manage and help structure this for the committee level. And that's essentially your role, and that is the chief governance officer role. So at the end of the day, if we're doing this properly, supporting you in your practice in doing so, we'll go to the next slide and look what the governance team can say yes or no to. When we get a case coming across through the plan champion process, coming across into the RLC for support, which is part of implicitly the offer that's available through Mark and his team, we run through this as part of the checklist. So you'll get an example of when we do a governance process checklist in support of you. What do we see? Well, we're going to ask you to ask these questions at the committee level. Do each understand his or her duties, rights, and obligations? And after you go through a little bit of a primer here, are they determining in their heart of hearts, is it yes or no? More often than not, we're seeing no. That's not bad. That's where you come in and you're there to resolve it. You know, does the sponsor and the committee understand the nature and the type of the services across the board? All these different service providers that are needed? Is it a yes or no? Well, you're going to flip it into a yes. Do they know who their planned service providers are? And do they have documentation how they are operating as a co-fiduciary or not? Most often we get a no there in an honest answer. You're going to flip that to a yes. And do any of the service providers have a documented fiduciary contract? If they don't, they're not. So again, what you're doing is you're crafting on the next slide this governance team. And if the authority is granted, the plan committee, you know, has the duty to monitor and evaluate all these fiduciary services. And they can obligate somebody on the committee, or they need to obligate somebody on the committee to that. And who is that person they're going to obligate it to? Well, you can imagine who that is. That is naming effectively that chief governance officer. That chief governance officer is the one that is responsible for the umbrella, the structure, the reporting, the monitoring and supporting the committee in achieving this governance process. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see how we're graphically putting this together. It puts you as the plan advisor really as the central hub, the synchronizer, the orchestrator, the maestro, if you will, of all of these various service providers who are receiving compensation to support the plan sponsor in the management of the plan, and you're pulling all these together. The services that are provided through the Plan Champion program that RLC supports on is helping you do a governance review, a holistic governance review of all these various documents, from the record keeper to the TPA, the custodian, the trustee, if there's another consultant involved, and any other fiduciaries that are there. Each of those have service agreements. Each of those service agreements need to be evaluated and synchronized in their language to have an appropriate governance process, which allows you on the next slide to have better committee meetings with a process that's written down, with the meeting times and dates, with the agenda and the minutes. And that, in a nutshell, helps you address an overall governance umbrella overview. Now let's go to the next slide and talk about something that the industry has talked about long and hard, and that's the fiduciary services and obligations. Now, we're not dismissing that the F word is important in our industry, but we're saying the G word is the overarching word that we really want you leading with. And the fiduciary selection is just one aspect of the governance process. And we're going to help plan sponsors through your governance role to be better consumers of the available fiduciary services that are out there. Of course, the fiduciary services that a plan sponsor can engage in are a 338, a 321, a 316, and for their participants, a 408G. I give you a little analogy here, Mark. I think you like this one. How do you explain this to a plan sponsor in English? Well, I say if I was out one evening, which occasionally can happen, and I needed to hail an Uber to get home, right? And I got in the back of the Uber and I immediately took a nap and I abdicated the responsibility for getting me home to the Uber driver. What type of a Uber experience, if we translated that into ERISA land, did I engage in? Well, that would be a 338. I was a passive and I was obligating and abdicating the responsibility of the ride to the Uber driver. So therefore, I was a 338 type of buyer. If you have a passive plan sponsor who's not going to engage in the process for whatever reason that might be, time constraints, or they feel they just want to put you in charge of it, they're a 338 buyer. That's a simple explanation, and it refines you in your search and your approach to that plan sponsor. Now, if I jumped in the front seat of the Uber after that evening out and I said, hey, I need to get home, let's make a left here, let's make a right here, we're going to save 5 minutes. I'm engaged in the process. I get home a little faster. What type of a fiduciary buyer was I of that Uber ride? Well, being active and engaged with the rider, with the driver, I was a 321 buyer. And then if I was really, saying, hey, before I get in this car, I want to take a look at what's under the hood and make sure that the mechanics are working fine. What was I doing there? Well, I was a 316 buyer, right? I was looking at the plumbing that's under the hood. And if I shared the ride with anybody else, then I'd be talking about 408G there, because that's all about delivering fiduciary services at the participant level. So there's my Uber analogy, Mark. I hope that everybody enjoyed that. And sometimes the plan sponsors like an English translation of the technical matters that are at hand. But at the end of the day, if we look at the next slide, here's the opportunity for you as a governance officer to identify this educated consumer aspect of the fiduciary selection and purchase of the plan sponsor. Not all of these fiduciary services are created equally. The contract terms really are germane and essential, particularly in that 316 buy. If you're buying a 316 fiduciary service and it doesn't list that it's covering payroll, then guess what's not covered? Payroll. Now, who's going to review those contracts for you? Well, as a plan champion, you dial that into the good old RLC and we'll do that analysis for you. The settlement provisions also in the contract, and what is backing that fiduciary obligation. Again, this is an opportunity for you to differentiate on the fiduciary selection as part of the overall governance process, so you kind of get where we're going here. And then hammering home on the next slide, educating the plan sponsor, which we still have many plan sponsors who appear to be uneducated, the right and wrong reasons for bringing in outside co-fiduciaries. Number one, if you're paying somebody, shouldn't they be on the same side of the church aisle you in terms of liability? Well, that's whether they have a fiduciary contract or not. But the right reasons to bring in that co-fiduciary, because the plan sponsor cannot abdicate essentially all of their fiduciary responsibilities. The right reason is to really augment the skill set that's needed to bring this governance process to life. The wrong reason, which we still find many plan sponsors thinking, is that they've eliminated their fiduciary responsibility, which they've not. So let's go to the next slide here. Are the committee members experts in these types of conversations and decisions? And I think we all know the answer here. They're probably not. And let's go back to those four cornerstones. We've got the exclusive benefit rule. What's the next one? Prudent expert rule. So if they're not expert in the matters that you're discussing here in the governance process, which Plan Champion has beautiful white papers for you. They have checklists for you to share with your clients. As Mark said, they can be co-branded right under your label. If they're not going to be experts, then what do they have to do? How do they fill the knowledge gap? Well, let's look at the next slide. And that's where we really crystallize this. And this is part of the experience we want you to bring to that plan sponsor. If they're deficient, it's not a bad thing. Nobody's going to have the final contestant on ERISA Jeopardy in-house. They need to bring that in as part of the, their process here as their prudent expert rule. And there you go on the far right side, the synchronizer, the maestro, if you will, the person that's putting the umbrella over the whole organization is that chief governance officer. And that is really what we're putting on the next slide. What is a chief governance officer? Well, it pretty much probably defines everybody that's listening to this right now. It's an individual that possesses the understanding of the overall retirement industry, of the products and services that are available, with an intimate knowledge of the details of the particular plan that you're talking about and the various service providers that are getting compensated for the management of that plan. It brings that skill set to the table with the coordination and the risk making and the decision making that balances between the prudent decisions for the business and the appropriate decisions to nail that exclusive benefit rule for the participants that are in the plan. It identifies when you have a challenging market, and Lord knows we've had one this year, how you navigate through that. And it may or may not be a voting member on the committee. And Mark and I have talked about this. I think that you could actually go in and do a governance review as an entree, as an a la carte service to a plan sponsor, and that might be your way in the door. Because on the next slide at the end of the day, what a chief governance officer brings to the table is an effective team that brings ERISA fundamentals. It deals with conflicts of interest. It deals with the fees. It deals with the investment benchmarking, but it takes us to a next level of how effective was the plan. So, of course, the next slide that I'm going to show you here is plan investments, which is a cornerstone of what financial advisors like you do, but it is not the only thing. And we think the opportunity to differentiate with the governance process while still do an exceptional job at the plan investment side of the equation with selection and monitoring is key, but broadening your palette into this governance officer role certainly, I think, is a big differentiator. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, John, I totally agree. What's really unique, I think, about this chief governance officer idea is the magnitude of the impact it could have on a plan is really, really strong. But the actual output and the time and energy that it would take for a financial advisor to kind of organize all this is minimal in respect to that impact. So I think, John, it's just an incredible idea to differentiate yourself as an advisor and bring something kind of new to the table. And what we've seen is, right, we've seen this fiduciary process evolve over the years. And at first it was just, hey, you know what, there is no fiduciary process. So let's kind of think about that. Okay, well, let's put a process around how we selected the products and maybe some of the investments and call it a day. And then that evolved over the years to where we've lived for quite some time, which is that funds, fees, and fiduciary value prop that we've seen a lot of people in the marketplace put forth. And super valuable. It was an evolution over Fiduciary 1.0. John, I think what we're talking about here is the next evolution, which is Fiduciary 3.0. And having that chief governance officer focus on the process of investing, the plan administration, and probably more important now than ever, participant outcomes and financial wellness. So on the next slide, what we wanted to cover is we at MassMutual have partnered with Hero 7 to provide a tool that could be complementary and supportive to the chief governance officer. We're not suggesting that this has to be the end-all be-all tool. You can certainly do it a lot of different ways, but we feel this really kind of bridges the gap and makes it easy for the financial advisor and plan sponsor to kind of get a sense for where they're at. So if you go to the next slide, it can range from roughly 80 questions for an existing plan sponsor. So that's one that you know and you're going to dive in and continue to provide support for. Or if you just kind of want to get a sense of where they're at and it's a prospect, it would be roughly 25 questions. It will provide a score, a 100-point score across those three areas, process of investing, plan administration, and participant outcomes. And it's not really, did you get a 90? Did you get a 20? Did you get whatever? It is more about where do you fall and then how can we move up that scale? We have run over 1,200 reports with Hero 7, and the average score of a prospect is 44. The average score of a client is 74. So really you're demonstrating value quite quickly when you can show kind of the advancements and the improvements. So if you go to the next slide, what we have noticed out of those roughly 1,200 plans that were run is some real big gaps that are out there from a fiduciary process. 86% of plan sponsors do not document their 316 duties for their TPA admin if they have one. 77% do not have documentation regarding the QDIA process. 79% do not have documentation on their financial wellness program and how it's working. And then 89% do not have documentation that the fiduciaries acknowledge their fiduciary status in writing. So again, John, tell me, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. These feel like relatively easy lifts to improve, but super critical for a plan sponsor to be paying attention to.
Well, you're nailing it, Mark. And you know, it's interesting to note that the Hero 7 process that you layer kind of as a front end graphical, easy way to kind of bring this to light.
Yeah.
When we end up doing the governance reviews, as you well know, Mark, you're nailing what the big four are, right? You know, we talked about this earlier. If you have a 316, but it's not in writing, or you don't know exactly what's in writing, that's that 86%. That's one of the big deficiencies we see in every governance. Really easy to point out, really easy for a chief governance officer advisor to fix, right? The QDIA one, Mark, that you bring up, you know, how many plans have their grandmother's Oldsmobile QDIA that came into place back in 06, 07 with the Pension Protection Act? You know, target date funds are a good solution, but you have to be documenting the consideration of the evolution of the QDIA marketplace, and that's a big deficiency that we see. The glaring one, Mark, that you point out here, number 3, more so than ever, participants, again, you know, the exclusive benefit rule, what are we doing for the participants from a wellness perspective? More so than ever in this environment, that's been a glaring omission in many of the plans that we're doing these governance reviews on for our chief governance officer, plan champion advisors. And then just the flat out omission where they say, yeah, I've got a fiduciary or a co-fiduciary, but they don't have a written document about that, which means what, Mark? It means they don't have a fiduciary, right?
Yeah.
So it's great stats, and it leads me into the next part of our presentation, which I will attempt to go through quickly. This is the exciting stuff, Mark. Reporting and disclosure compliance. You always give me the gems here. But it really leads into what you just laid out here. And this is what we do at the RLC as part of the Plan Champion process. We go through the governance review in partnership with you, the Chief Governance Officer, newly minted advisor. And we're going to go through this, you know, it's our job to go through the gory details of reporting and disclosure compliance, report it to you in a nice little package, because what we often find here is what we just outlined through Mark's statistics is, you know, the plan sponsor is sitting there and you're creating these deficiencies, and here's the answer that we get on the right. Gee, I thought that so-and-so was doing that or responsible for that. Well, let's go back to our original. No, you plan sponsor, if there's deficiency, you are the one that's responsible for it. Good thing that I'm here, meaning you, the Chief Governance Officer, to point it out. And with a little bit of fix, we can do it. On the next slide, we go through the reporting and disclosure compliance aspects of a good governance process. We're going to look at plan documents and amendments. Are they deficient? We're going to look at IRS testing. We're going to look at 5500 reporting. We're going to look at participant reporting, all the exciting things, but many times we find deficiencies here. And many times we'll find on the next slide that there's conflicts of interest. And as I said at the beginning, when we find a conflict of interest, it's not the end of the world, but a good chief governance officer is going to come in and say, okay, we've got some conflicts here. How are we going to address them? Obviously, if you leave them in place, once identified, that becomes a problem. But at the end of the day, if we identify conflicts of interest, there are mitigation strategies that we bring to the table that the governance officer is going to uncover and fix. And let's go to the next slide and take a look at the documents and governance. Now, ERISA must follow plan documents. Again, that's where we're going to have the overlay of this governance role, where we're identifying in the weeds of those documents. And that's a good job for RLC to do on your behalf, because the plan documents actually equate to the law. And the plan documents, there's no boilerplate on the next slide. They're varied. They're all over the place. And there's many of them that are out there that are driving the plan. Now we're starting to crystallize the strategy that we talked about. There could be a plan document written by the record keeper, right? There could be a trust and custodian agreement. There could be a summary plan description that you know, might be out of sync. Record keeping agreements, there could be fiduciary agreements. What does the plan governance policy statement do? It synchronizes all those. And who's your back office to do that work? Well, through your Plan Champion program, that's the RLC, to read those documents, summarize it, and bring it back to you. On the next slide, we'll show you some of the examples that we actually saw here. We pulled these, Mark, out of some of the cases that actually came to us through the Plan Champion program. Scenario 1 said an investment policy statement called for an investment class that's not permitted in the plan document. Well, that could be a problem. You know, if you look at the Tussey ABB case, that's exactly one of the definitions that we found. There was an inconsistency between the investment policy statement and the actual practice. The 338 in this case was contracted with a service provider without the plan document having the authority to do so. We were able to uncover that. We served that up to the Chief Governance Officer Advisor. That's you. You go in there as the hero, saving the day as the plan champion. Another one, we had another issue with the plan investment policy statement. and it talked about the asset decisions and what was fiduciary, but the plan document, various fiduciaries were being utilized. It wasn't clear who was really responsible for this. So these are the little things that we find in the weeds, the little nuggets that really take the practicality of naming a governance officer. And I can tell you, Mark, every time we get a plan and a case, we're going to find these type of inconsistencies because there has not been the synchronization across the multiple service providers that this governance process brings to the table. It's a real win for the plan sponsor, and obviously a tremendous advantage for you as an advisor bringing this to the table. So if we go to the next slide, documents and governance are must-haves. You have to have clear lines of authority. The roles must be defined. Processes must be consistent. So when we look at the next graphic example, what we're going to do in this governance process, in the next slide, we show the little bubbles here, is we're going to review all the documents here at RLC that you help amalgamate for us. We're going to align those in writing for you to allow you to go in there and amend and draft policies where applicable, and utilize and implement. So at the end of the day, it's very important on our next slide to show the important oversights of elements, which is reviewing the plan provisions, reviewing the service provider documentations. That's great use of our time. And then you ensuring the record keeping and payroll is consistent with the plan providers as well as the other documents. So I hope that you're finding this exciting stuff and creating a new role as the Chief Governance Officer of your clients that are existing and maybe more importantly, your prospects. So Mark, I'm going to kick it back to you. What are the next steps that folks who like this need to do to engage?
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks for making governance fun. I didn't know you had that capability, so good job there. So I think what we're looking at is, and where MassMutual really wants to add value for you as the advisor is, we don't want you to do it alone. We don't want to just bring good ideas to the table for you and then leave it to you. We want to bring good ideas and then help you execute. So the first thing that you obviously want to think about is incorporating this Chief Governance Officer, putting some documentation together, and that's where we can work together. We can connect you with RLC. You can do kind of a quick deep dive, do an assessment, and piece everything together. And then the second step after that is once that's kind of organized, we can leverage the Hero 7 tool. If that's something that you're interested in, you can get a logon and a password, and from there you can kind of go through all those questions and assess where they're at. And then, of course, at the back end of that, once you do that assessment, we have RLC again there to support you to kind of go through and figure out, okay, how can we add value? How can we make some improvements to this plan? So the next slide here, if you want access to any or all of these tools, and again, we're not looking to replace your process, we're simply looking to be additive to your process. And if you want any or all of these tools, feel free to contact us at the 800 number here, and we'll be happy to support and talk with you about that. So with that, John, as always, really appreciate your time and energy. I'm going to try and get this presentation on CNBC as well, so I can make some improvements to my bio. And again, if anybody needs anything out there as an advisor, please feel free to reach out. Thanks, and have a great day.